You are within me, O my God, and I possess the gift of life because you permit me to share your life, and you are in me so that I may continue to live. It is through you and in you that my intellect perceives and my heart loves what is truly good. Your goodness is so great that, not satisfied with bringing me into existence, you are permanently engaged in preserving me by indwelling within me. I believe all these truths, O my God, because you have revealed them to me. Grant me the grace to derive profit from this belief by having you always before my mind. St. John Baptist de La Salle.
Praise us.
With Jesus in our hearts.
Amen.
Well, welcome back. I hope no one had any disastrous experiences. All right. We have two things to do today. One is to cover this period of expansion, and the other is to take a look at the Clement affair. Tomorrow we'll deal with that whole problem of the founder's disappearance in the South. So we have to get a little bit acquainted with the South. Right? But before we go south, we first have to get some kind of an idea of Rouen. Now, we left the founder, what seems like weeks ago, last Thursday noon. We left him in the parish of St. Roch. Now remember, the Paris thing, this is the Seine River, and here's Saint-Sulpice and all of that, and the Rue Princesse, and all of that trouble with Chez-Tardy, and all of the trouble up here in Saint-Antoine, over by the Bastille. So the writing master's going after that, Chez-Tardy, and all this trouble and so on. So the founder had opened a little school here across the Seine, right opposite where the Louvre is today, in the parish of St. Roch, on the Rue Saint-Honoré. And so when the whole thing fell apart in Saint-Antoine, the founder moved the novices back to the Rue Princesse, and he himself went to live with a few priests and the brothers who were teaching him at school there. And this becomes sort of his headquarters during all of this period. So that's, we have to kind of be locating the founder now, not so much, he's staying out of Chez-Tardy's way, he's living here more or less, and while he's there, already in 1704, he begins negotiations with the people up in Rouen, where he's hearing very favorable things. So we have the whole story of the foundations in Rouen. It begins with Darnétal, where Madame Maillefer earlier had established a school for poor girls. After getting firmly established there, he's then able, with the connivance of the Archbishop and Monsieur de la Pointe-Carré, to bring the brothers to Rouen, where they're put in almost intolerable conditions into the hospital, the hospice, the hôpital, and Hernandez doesn't translate the word. And then out of that, he's finally able to acquire the property at St. Yon, which becomes a permanent center for the Institute. So you have the map here, huh? And, I have Paris. That's no help. I was having problems this morning. I came out with the wrong folder. Couldn't go back and get it. Now I find I got the wrong map. Oh well. So you see the Seine. Now, of course, this time the Seine is at the bottom of the map, but you have a right bank and a left bank in Rouen also. So you see the little sign there, that's the road out to Darnétal. It's a couple of miles outside the city. When you come into Rouen from Paris, you come first to Darnétal itself. And so we established a school there, and the resources weren't very strong, but at any rate, he was willing to get a foothold in the diocese. The Niels, the hospital where Niel had come from in 1679, and where De La Salle first brought the brothers and housed them, there's number one. You have the various parishes. Now, Rouen was divided. In Rouen, the religious education for the poor was not in the hands of the individual pastors, but there was a school board that had control of this. So the Rouen situation was different from that in Paris. But at least it kept the writing masters and the schoolmasters out from raising trouble. So he begins with the parish of Saint-Maclou. That's a very interesting parish because right behind the church was a large cemetery. But that cemetery, the ancient cemetery, had been abandoned, and they built a school building around the corners of the cemetery. And that building is still standing and can visit it. Maybe I'll show you a picture of it someday. And that's the parish where Blanc lived, by the way, and that's the parish where Blanc died. So that's number 4 there. Then that was the first school that they opened, living in the hospital, and then little by little the brothers were located in all 4 of the major parishes there. The cathedral is the dead center there where the archbishop was, and we have 2 archbishops here. The first one, Archbishop Colbert, is very favorable to the brothers. The second one, Daubigny, gives the founder a very hard time. He had met him first at Chartres, where he was the auxiliary to Godet de Moray, and he never liked the founder, and that only created more trouble for him in Reims right up to his dying day. The house of the president is there near the number 7. Over there, do I have here someplace where the number 2 up there is where the Minims are, where Father Barre had lived, and that was his community while he was there. Way over to the left on 12 is the present-day school of John Baptiste de La Salle. An enormous big basilica was built there to house the relics of the founder because he died in Rouen, and so after the French Revolution, when they were able to recover the founder's relics, that school was built in the 19th century. It was built as a big basilica to house the founder's relics permanently. As we'll see, the founder's relics, the founder's body never rested in peace. St. Jan is way on the other side of the Seine. 10 is the parish, the local parish, and that's what creates all the trouble with the founder. And that triangular piece of property is number 11. Now, as you know, Brother Augustine has edited and participated in this study of St. Jan, translated what was started off in life as a licentiate dissertation of a Swiss brother, and but it's been considerably expanded. It's all in the, so there's a whole full. Have you all seen that book, The Brothers at St. Jan? I don't know if it's around. Is it, Gus? Are there copies of it any place?
I haven't seen it in a while now.
There certainly must be a copy in that Lasallian room, but there's pictures there and descriptions of the whole history of the thing, all the way, carrying it all the way through the 18th century, and with clear maps of the property and everything else. I believe I reproduced that also in the work as yours. So that's just to get our heads set into Rouen. Now, I presume you've all read this. You had enough time to read all the way to the end, I suspect. Didn't you? So, I'm not going to repeat everything that's in Blanc. I just create a little mood here where we're in Rouen. We see the problems that the founder had. What do you want to discuss about Rouen, or what do you want to raise about that? Yes, Peter.
It seems that he was really getting hassled in Rouen by everybody. I just don't understand why he stayed. They weren't getting paid like everybody seems to be on, and they seem to from the start, they wanted to get rid of him. Bill Sal agreed to this experiment, but he didn't, say, well, it's not working, and let's just pack up and leave.
Yeah, but where would he go?
See, this is 1705, huh? And if you go back to what we were talking about last Thursday, already all of those lawsuits are in the works, huh? And the negative judgment is just a few months away, and he's looking for a new center, and he maybe has, and we talked the last time, remember, about the attitude he had towards Paris, that he might have been perfectly willing to let that whole thing get down the drain. But if he was going to be very passive there, then I suppose he had to be a little more aggressive to try to get a solid foothold in Rouen, and I think he saw an opportunity there, and little by little, he may have had his eye on the novitiate situation too, and so in order to reestablish, because remember now, the novices had been battered from pillar to post, they were going back and forth all over the place, and he was looking for a more permanent center, and he probably thought that Rouen offered some possibility. So, and of course, in fact, before the year was out, he had title or had leased the property at St. Jan and did have a permanent settlement there. So I guess, does anybody else see any reason about that? The conditions, of course, we imagine it's very, very, see, we've seen a lot about the founder's inflexibility and all that sort of stuff, but I think he has shown in some of these things a fair amount of willingness to experiment or try with something different. Putting them in that hospital, for example, and allowing them to be used practically as slave labor, replacing ecclesiastics who have been doing the same thing, huh? But taking care of all of those inmates and so on, and feeding them, getting them up and getting them dressed, and then going off to school, and then coming back and feeding them again before they could eat themselves, and then going back long distances across town to these 4 schools. You can see there, not 15, 20-minute walk, but to do all of that and go back to school and back and forth, and then take care of them in the evening again. That certainly, they were doing work that was certainly outside the educational thing. And then when Blank gives the statistics, so one brother had 150 kids in one class, huh? And they were getting paid very little wages. George?
I was going to ask, regard to St. John, having a boarding school and a school for delinquents and all this kind of stuff with the novitiate, any comments how big were these operations?
Oh, well, that property is even today still, it's quite extensive. What would you say, Gus, comparing it to this campus, huh? It would certainly be as big as the main flat part here, huh?
I have no idea of the exact dimension. I've never really focused on it.
Yeah, but if you look at that map, for example, he had several different buildings there. These people were all housed in different buildings, and you can visit the thing today still. And there were a lot of extensive gardens and things around. So as Blas says, he had all 3 of these operations going eventually, but they were able to stay out of one another's way fairly well. Huh? There are absolutely fascinating stories about that prison where they had the prisoners locked up with the letters of cachet. Now, of course, this didn't all happen in the first year they were there, but to do like Bland does and pursue the thing to the end. But all through the century, a lot of these characters managed to escape, huh? And the monks would go running after them in the middle of the night, and all the people in the neighborhood and so would be cheering on the escapees, and trying to thwart the monks chasing out after them and all that sort of stuff. We have a lot of stories from that. And of course, St. Jan becomes a very important center to hold the institute together after the founder's death, because Bartholomew was quickly succeeded by Timothy, and this is where the superiors were resident. And Timothy's right-hand man was this famous Brother Irenee, for whom I don't have an awful lot of enthusiasm, because he was sort of the Cornelius Luke type of his day. And he was both the director of novices and an assistant at the same time. And he was totally opposed to opening more schools, and he didn't want the brothers to get too involved in schoolwork. He was a very contemplative type and wanted a more monastic spirituality. And I think that's my theory anyway. That's where all that started. And then, of course, the opening of the boarding school meant that they were giving more advanced education, and it's Battersby who says that it's the boarding school at St. Jan where no Latin was taught, but where all of these subjects, the advanced subjects, were practical subjects that effectively it was one of the first secondary or somewhat higher educational schools in the field of professional, pre-professional education. So it's a rather significant thing, you know, and of course the brothers lost it during the French Revolution. They've never been able to get it back, and as a matter of fact, the authorities at one time absolutely forbade brothers to be to go there and so on and so forth. I understand the last group or two of the Ciel people have, or the Sil, have, when they make their pilgrimage, have been able to get into the building, and they've been able to get into some of those places where the dungeons were, and they also be able to get into the building that the brothers built after the founder's death to house his relatives.
This idea came to me yesterday while I was reading beyond this up into the Middle Kings,
Yeah.
but maybe it's part of why LaSalle put up with all this stuff. Hidden into Blaine's LaSalle spending all day long on his knees is all of this writing and stuff. I wonder how much of it might have started back here because he was relatively close by most of what was going on there. That he did have time then to deal with all this administrative stuff that, that he was trying to get a hold of.
There's no question, but I don't think he did. I don't think he, by writing, you mean writing his texts and books. Now he'll do a lot. Most of that seems to have been done either in the Vaugirard period or down in the south, in Grenoble. Anything else about Rouen?
Did the founder have in mind when he built up this operation here at Saint-Lô, the model in his mind of what was on the Rue Neuve in Reims, many operations functioning under the one roof sort and many different things. It becomes quite complex, doesn't it?
It is complex, and I had never thought of that. This property is much more extensive, however, for one thing, and for another thing, the operations are different. In Reims, in the Rue Neuve, it was the community, a small community, and then the juniorate, and then the school for training teachers. There's no school for training teachers here at Rouen, except, of course, the novitiate. And there's a novitiate now instead of a juniorate, and then there's the boarding school and the school for delinquent kids, and there's 3 communities of brothers. So there's three communities of brothers and 3 operations: the boarding school, the school for delinquents, and the prison.
One makes it sound like they had practically no contact with each other. How realistic?
Well, there were some contacts because Gus might help me out, have to help me out on this, but the delinquents attended some of the ceremonies, went to chapel with the boarding students, but did they go to some of their classes?
Yeah.
Yes, I think so. But their residents, they were kept apart and much more disciplined, for residential purposes. And the prisoners were kept totally isolated and separated until they proved that they could be trusted a little bit, and then they began to bring them out. You have to read the book. Read Gus's book. It's very, very fascinating thing to read. It gives you a real sense of the early days of the Institute.
Initially, in the case of the school board, they were opposed to the brothers some because they thought the city would have to support them.
Yes, yeah, and
Is that what continued to be the real reason why they continue to oppose?
well, I guess, see, for part of it may well be that prior to the brothers' arrival there, all of this, the schools existed, and they were being taught, and the hospital was being maintained and supported by seminarians. So this was a way that seminarians were able to earn some living while they were studying for the priesthood, and that's kind of a pattern all through this. The founder has to fight that in many places. And this, of course, was Damia's system down in Lyon, and we'll see the same problem in Marseille. So the idea of using clerics during the period of their training to do this type of thing and so on. So I suppose they came more cheaply, for one thing. And I also think that probably the board had an idea that De La Salle had his own way of doing things also. I suppose that was the reason for the opposition of the school board, but it's interesting that the school board had so much power that they could book both the archbishop and Poincaré, who was the president of the parliament. So it must have been a very, very powerful organization.
I'm sort of surprised that there's virtually no contact with, let us say, relatives, friends, and so on, to go to the prisoners or the delinquents or the boarding school. There's not, for visits or for whatever we do today. There don't seem to be a big part of how are my boys doing or anything,
Well, some of that might have been happening. We don't really know.
No.
You can't argue from silence. But as happens with many boarding schools, the parents are very often glad to get rid of them. They put them there because they couldn't control themselves. And I suspect also with the type of discipline that was imposed at the time, extensive visits for relatives and so on were not encouraged. And the ones who had their relatives put in the prison thing, they definitely wanted to get rid of them. Okay, all right, now let's go to South. Now again, we have this whole big long list of foundations. Now, of course, while all this terrible trouble is going on in Paris, remember, 1705, 1706, this is the period when all of those lawsuits were coming at the founder, and he's losing everything, and in all kinds of opposition, and the brothers are suffering because of they're being pursued by the writing masters who are coming snooping around in the school and everything and so on. And here's what's old De La Salle doing, but he's stretching the Institute around a little bit. So if you take this map, I prepared this originally for beginnings, and Gus was good enough to do the lettering. You see his fine hand here in this thing. So this map has appeared many places, but it's good to have us in front of us to get some sense of where these places are. So the upper triangle now is already pretty well filled in with the three main centers in Reims, Paris, and then Rouen, with Rethel and Lyon and Law, founded out of Reims, and Darnétal, founded even before Rouen, and Versailles and Chartres, founded out of Paris and Troyes. Okay, so, but now the founder begins to make it deep, and he's already, as we saw the last time, he's already in Avignon, down in the south. So now he begins to spread around a little bit more and fill in some of these places. So Dijon, to see where that is, and that's on the main train line. If you go by train from Paris to Marseille, the principal stops are Dijon. Lyon, Lyon is not on the map because the founder never had a school there, but maybe you better put it in. Of course, we say in French, in English, lions. We pluralize these things in English, but they're singular in French for some strange reason. So it's Marseille, Marseilles, or Marseille, and Versailles, or Versailles. Lyon is, go down to Marseille, down at the bottom, with your finger, and that's the kind of a delta there. That's the Rhone River. Keep going up past Avignon, and all the way up until you come to the first break. You see where it turns off to the right. That's the Rhone River, and that's at that juncture. There's where Lyon is. The river coming down from the north is the Saône River, S-A-O-N-E. And the Saône and the Rhone join at Lyon, and the Rhone turns east and goes all the way up into that little pond, which of course is a great big lake, and that's Lake Geneva in Switzerland. It's Italy below and Germany above. Right, so the main route is out of Paris, Dijon, Lyon, Avignon, Marseille. That's the train route. And that's the highway route now too, the superhighway. Okay, so Dijon is what's it famous for mostly? Mustard. And all of this Grey Poupon stuff we have, that's made in Connecticut. If you ever brought it to Dijon, they would wonder, well, you call this mustard? Well, every time I go to Rue de Sèvres, they put Dijon mustard on the table in a big long tube. It looks like a tube of toothpaste. And I always manage to squeeze a tube, to get a tube out of the econome to bring back home with me. It's marvelous. There's another thing it's famous for too. The facade of the cathedral is the biggest collection of gargoyles. The whole facade of the cathedral is just covered with gargoyles. Rows and rows and rows of gargoyles. In most cathedrals they're just sticking off the edge. there's a whole facade filled with them. Some of them quite interesting. Some of them a little scatological too, and as you know, I have a flair for that type of thing, but anyway. One of my defects that I never get rid of. I have no intention of getting rid of it either. All right, so that's Dijon. This pastor was very interested in getting the brothers, and he was backed by this Gergy, who keeps popping up all over the place, this name. He was an assistant pastor in St. Sulpice. And at the very end, if you remember, with the compromise of the affair with Chez Tardy, he was the one who was assigned to issuing those tickets to certify that the families were really poor. All right, so these connections, there's a lot of what we today call networking. We find wound up with 3 schools there. And none of the original schools exist, the buildings don't exist, but there is one that the founder visited on his way back that's still standing. And there's a picture of that in the St. Jan book too. Now, but there's nothing terribly exciting about the Dijon thing. Marseille is very important, and Blanc starts with Marseille before he puts Rouen. So that's one reason why the reading goes a little bit back and forth. And on page 13, 14, and 15, now it's Marseille, of course, where the founder really feels totally abandoned and goes into that dark night of the soul. But Blanc seems so determined here, he brings the whole thing. All of the stuff on page 14 and 15 is talking about what ultimately happens in the 1720s and the 1730s, long after the founder is dead. So for some reason or other, it certainly doesn't help at all to get these flash aheads. So he just barely, and he has the dates a little haywire also. So at any rate, what happened here was these 2 laymen from Marseille happened to be visiting Avignon, where the school had already been established in 1703. And they saw the brothers, and they saw what was going on in the school. They said, oh, this is terrific. We better see if we can get some brothers for Marseille. So the founder sent 2 brothers from Avignon to Marseille in 1706. Now that will prove to be very significant, as we shall see. Now keep in mind, in all of this stuff, until we get down to 1711, all of these foundations from 1705 to 1700, the founder is not personally involved at all. When he goes down there for the first time, that's the first time he sees these establishments that he set up. So the founder is not physically in the picture here. He's dispatching brothers to all of these places, and I think that's very important to keep in mind. Marseille, of course, is a port city. It's a fascinating city. It's built around the harbor, kind of a horseshoe-shaped harbor, featured in the French Connection, if you remember. It's a very beautiful city, big hill up over here to this side. And then the city was divided into 4 parishes. The cathedral was here, and the parish of St. Laurent was here, right in the closest to the sailors' quarters, closest to the entrance to the harbor. And so here's where the school was set up. There was a plan when the brothers first got there, and as they began to throw, the school was an instantaneous success, and the brothers replaced one of these ecclesiastics again. But there was a plan to have the brothers take over the schools in all 4 parts of the city, and that plan will fall apart, and that will be part of our work for tomorrow, to talk about that some more. So all we're doing here is getting these places established. But it's most important when you're preparing for your stuff tomorrow to have some sense of the geography and where these places are. So all we're interested in doing here today is getting them in there. Okay, so then in 1707 we get to Mende. Now Mende was the westernmost extent of the founder. And if you look at that map in front of you, you just can't possibly envision from what you're seeing there that the type of territory that's here. It's very mountainous, and it's like a series of Grand Canyons. When you're traveling through this territory, and if we ever do Buttimer IV, it's an absolute must that we go to these places. Right above Les Vents there would be Saugues, by the way, where Benilde was. But you go down the side of these gullies, and you go way down to the bottom, and then you climb all the way up the other side and so on. And then you go down another one, and you climb all the way up, and you're on a plateau for a while. And you have to do that about 2 or 3 times. Huh? And the founder's doing most of this on foot. When I did it, a good friend of mine, French brother from Saint-Étienne, which is just a little bit away from Lyon there, he took me in a Volkswagen, and the Volkswagen was having a hard job getting up those hills, let me tell you. So imagine what it was like doing it on Shank's mare. And some of the stories about Benilde, too. Benilde almost got killed a couple of times in the wagons going back and forth to retreats and things. So but it's absolutely fascinating, very rugged, but very beautiful country to go all the way there to Mons. And maybe we'll see some pictures of it if we ever get to that. Okay, now the big thing about the Calvinism, the cathedral in Mons was actually attacked physically by the Huguenots and defended, and there was a great deal of bloodshed just prior to this period in the late 16th century. And that's, I think, why Blanc goes so wholehearted against the Calvinists shedding all the Catholic blood. Huh? Well, of course, blood was shed very extensively on both sides, needless to say. And any Calvinist that got caught did not exactly enjoy a peaceful death either. And so Blanc, of course, has absolutely, if he has no feeling for Jansenists, he certainly doesn't have much for Huguenots. The Calvinists in France are called Huguenots. Calvin never wanted, it's interesting that Lutheranism has always been called Lutheranism after Martin Luther. Huh? But Calvin never wanted his religious reform named after himself. And so it always gets called something else. In France, it's the Huguenots. In Scotland, it's the Presbyterians. That is named after the elders. Huh? And in Holland, it's the Dutch Reformed Church. So Calvin, and in England, it was the Puritans. Well, they're all Calvinists. But in Mons, the bishop, there's kind of relative peace there, realizes that the schools are very important, and so he was very, very favorable and wrote to De La Salle. So De La Salle, again, contrary to all of his usual policies, sends his best schoolman, Ponce, to start a school all by himself, way in this far remote outpost. Only for a couple of weeks, Ponce gets sick, and then he sends him another brother, but the bishop is absolutely delighted with Ponce. Maybe we should take a look at that. Page 54. The bishop is writing to De La Salle, "My dear sir, I cannot sufficiently bless God who inspired you with the idea of training schoolmasters to instruct the young and bring them up in Christian piety. Seminaries train good ecclesiastics, but good schoolmasters who give children the first impressions of piety and religion can help to sanctify all Christians. Nobody could be more pleased than I am with the brother you sent, who, while awaiting a second to help him, has already begun instructing our young people." Ponce was probably sent there to see what the possibilities were, and he decided to start teaching school right away. "I should be extremely obliged to you if you send us another able to teach both writing and arithmetic." Notice the invading the writing master's territory. "For this will attract all the youngsters, and thus we can impart to them the rudiments of Christian piety." So that apparently was one of the features of our schools, too. That they were, unlike the schoolmasters who mostly concentrated on reading, we had a full, rounded-out curriculum that included those skills that were very important to have, namely mathematics and writing. "I will give the brothers all the protection they can expect from me, so they may be completely satisfied by their labors." Brother X, whose Ponce can tell you my high regard for him and for the school, so on and so forth. And so the bishop leaves an endowment to make sure that the brothers will be supported after his death. As Blanc says in the footnote on 55, the only bishop who ever did so. Then there's this account of this so-called schism in Mons, and Blanc obviously has this thing all mixed up and all wrong. It's a very, very difficult thing to try and straighten out. If you do the readings and encounters, I have a much more better summary of it, let's say, as to what we know. But there was this troublesome brother Medard who probably started the whole thing. And we'll see more of this when we come to the founders' visit down there too. But these two brothers who were at odds with one another, one of them got back to Paris when Bartholomew was in charge with his story, and Bartholomew believed that side of the story, but Henry, who stayed down there, finally gave his life in the plague and so on. So this crazy account of Blount is probably doesn't have very much foundation, and he may have gotten part of it from Bartholomew at some particular stage of the game. So anybody want to raise anything about that? But there certainly was not a question of anything like a formal schism. There seems to have been a bit of a problem as to exactly who was the director. And Gus, do you want to say anything about that? But that's part of the early brothers story too, isn't it? Because we do know the names of some of them. There was, of who the directors were there after Ponce. I think it was Anthony, and then a Bernardine, and then Henri, something like that. The brothers in Mond have written this story up for themselves, by the way, and one of them that I met there sent me a copy of it.
How long the time, I just recall, they didn't let him come in. How long was the founder?
But we'll come to that tomorrow.
He was never there at the beginning.
No. He won't get there till 1711. We'll talk about that tomorrow. Okay?
Is Blount exaggerating this, making this up, or confusing it with something else?
Probably both. Okay. Because you have all these little incidents going through of rebellious brothers, which is an interesting thing too. If he had confidence in them and trusted in them, some of them got carried away with whatever that confidence was that he had in them. There's that whole thing in Paris later on too, with the old Chétardy trying to lure the brother and get him to bring the whole bunch with him. Okay, so just to get a sense of Mond there. And of course, this bishop dies, and a new bishop comes in who's favorable to the founder, but equally favorable to the brothers.
In the case of the endowment like this for this holy bishop, would he keep it himself in his possession, and then it would go to the brothers in installments or something?
No, because there's an old saying, you can't take it with you. This is a legacy, huh? It's a legacy, so he was dead. So he left it to them, however, huh? And left enough of an endowment, and it's an endowed legacy. So the founder had title to it, and that was used to support the brothers. Okay, now Hernandez spells it A-L-A-I-S. It's usually spelled in French A-L-E-S with a grave accent on the end. And this was a hotbed of Calvinism. Now, of course, this is another aspect of the founders' policies that I think we would have to either apologize for or work our way around in light of today's ecumenism and so on. But there was no ecumenical movement going on here. Huh? Page 58. The remembrance of the horrible ravages that the rebellious Huguenots committed in the Cevennes, that's the mountain ranges, had not entirely died away even now. That region, reddened by the blood of Catholics, was the scene of Calvinism's last convulsive stand in France. There, more than anywhere else, heresy, combined with fanaticism, made use of fire and sword, showing the hatred that hell inspires towards the faithful members of the Roman Church. Catholics were torn to pieces, beheaded, and suffered martyrdom by new sorts of torments inflicted with unheard of cruelty. One can read about it in the history that was written. Finally, vanquished and forced into its last stronghold, Calvinism fell, a victim to its own frenzy, and had to yield to the arms of Marshal Villars, whom Louis XIV sent there to give the last blow to the cruel hydra that Calvin had nurtured for the misfortune of his own country, because Calvin was a Frenchman, and that for over a century had brought death and carnage wherever it went. So the next time you meet a Presbyterian, for example, you can remind them of the cruel hydra that launched the founder of their religious denomination. The great king who finally exterminated the pernicious error lurking under the mask of reform, which had caused his ancestors to tremble and wished to triumph over it as a Christian prince, and so forth. So he sets up the schools to get the next generation. But the brothers had a terrible time because they'd no sooner go home and then the parents would tell them, don't believe all that stuff the brothers tell you, our tradition is different. And poor old Bland doesn't have any problem because, after all, Calvinism is a very strict religion. And Bland, who has so much love for discipline and piety and all that sort of stuff, won't give the Calvinists a bit of credit for being the least bit religious or being staunch in their own faith. But they always have the wrong motives, whereas Christians are disciplined out of charity and love, whereas these people are just trying to fool people. Their virtue is only external, but the Catholic's virtue is all internal. Well, it's quite something. I wonder what old Blair would think if he could be around today with our ecumenical developments. So that's all it is. And the brothers are brought there through the intervention of this Merez, who writes this very interesting letter to the founder, saying he remembered him from St. Sulpice. He says, you probably don't remember me, but anyway, I'm the vicar general down here now, and the bishop was very anxious to have these people. And of course, the bishop's policy was, once he got the brothers there, everybody had to go to the brothers' school. And if they didn't, he had them fined and even imprisoned. So there was real force used trying to push Catholicism against the people. All right, in Grenoble, now Grenoble is, if you look at the map again, Grenoble, if you see where we put Lyon, and the Rhone River going up to Lake Geneva, the river that's leading into the Rhone from the east, there where Grenoble is, that's the Isère River, I-S-E-R-E. There's hardly a crossword puzzle that doesn't have Grenoble's river in it. And it's the Isère River. And it flows right through the middle of the town. The town is divided in two by it, like so many of these towns are. And the brothers' school was on the wrong side of the river, needless to say. So there's Grenoble, and of course it's right in the foothills of the Alps, very high mountains all around. Beautiful mountains. The Chartreuse Mountains are there, the Vercors Mountains are there, and this is where the Olympics were held a few years ago, weren't they? I guess quite a few years ago now. So it's a site for Winter Olympics. Beautiful city to see. The brothers were brought there by two former Sulpicians also. See, again, this Sulpician network. They were younger contenders. They were not there when the founder was there. They were considerably younger than the founder. And this Yves de Salioni later on became a bishop, but he's the one who was in charge. He was the chaplain at the hermitage at Parmedy where Sister Louise was. And so we have to keep our eye on Yves de Salion because he'll be very important in what we have to do tomorrow. The other was Claude Canel. They were canons of a collegiate church, not the cathedral in Grenoble, but on the one side of the river there was a church of St. Andrew that had a chapter of canons, as some churches did. And they were canons there, and they were instrumental in getting the brothers there. And it's the only instance of where they ever offered to pay the founder for the transportation to send them to there in the first place. And again, as in Marseille, the name of the parish where the brothers hold up is St. Lawrence. And both St. Lawrence churches are still extant. And if we get to see pictures, I'll show you a picture of that. Now, a sort of a harmless little foundation was set up in St. Denis. And Bland talks about it as if it's miles away. Actually, it's just a suburb of Paris. Today, the Paris metro goes there. It's a little bit out of town on the way to the airport. North of Paris, and St. Denis is very important because the cathedral there is one of the earliest of the Gothic cathedrals, and it's the cathedral where all the French kings were buried, and their tombs are there. And it's very, very impressive early Gothic cathedral, one of the, really the beginning of the French Gothic, beautiful thing to see. And so this Mademoiselle de Poignat was interested in getting a school started, and And Bland says the founder said to, but he was reluctant to do so because of these far away places, they created more trouble. It's oh, well, it's true in a way, but he had been doing that all through the whole decade. He said there were only 2 in Mond, which is a real far distance away. So why Bland makes a fuss about that at this point, I'm not so sure. Now, of course, this will be the source of what we have to talk about in the second hour. But that whole business is the location of where the Clermont affair breaks out. All right, 1700, in that same year, a couple of things happen. The founder seems to, while he's doing all this spreading around, apparently he becomes aware of the fact, and I guess this is part of his administrative genius, that how is he going to hold this whole thing together? Huh? So it's at this point that he appoints Ponce to be in charge of the schools in the South. Remember, he hasn't been there himself yet. He hasn't seen any of these foundations, and he hasn't been in touch with the brothers at all, except by letters. And so he puts Ponce in charge down in the South. Good, strong school organizer. If somewhat independent. And we also have surviving a letter where he delegates Brother Joseph to visit the communities in Reims, and we have a couple of those. And Gus may get into some of that with you. So he's beginning to have this is the origin, I guess, of the idea of our visitors, because that's what they're told to do, is to visit, hold the whole thing together. 1709, there's a terrible famine, and it's so bad, and the resources in Rouen and Saint-Yan were so meager that the founder decides to bring the novices down to the Rue de Bruyère in Paris, where he was, he had, if you remember, the problem he had with Chez Tardy, who didn't want him to buy the place, so he put this Brother Thomas and sent him out there some years earlier, so that the brothers in the Rue Princesse would have a place where there was a garden and where there was fresh air and so on. So he brings the novices down there, and a lot of them got scurvy. You have that whole story about how he isolated them, and Dr. Helvetius's friend was willing to treat all the brothers and so on. Now, one of those who got the scurvy and who failed to recover from it was Brother Bartholomew. And the brothers were encouraging the founder to get rid of him and to send him home. And there was a little bit of pressure from home. He had come from Douai, where his father was a schoolmaster, and the people in the parish wanted Bartholomew to come back and take over his father's school. And so the founder was all set to send him away the next particular day, but he spent the whole night in prayer and then finally decided no, he would keep him. There's a lot of problems about whether Bartholomew had vows at that time and what vows he had and so on and so forth. But it's one of those cliffhanger things, huh? So Bartholomew almost got thrown out of the institute. Now, of course, if you remember in the previous volume, Bland, when he talked about the opening in Chartres, carried the whole story all the way through again, way beyond the founder's death. But it was at this point in 1709 where problems began to develop in Chartres, again with this bishop who had been very good, who was the classmate of the founder, Bishop Godet de Marais. So Bishop Godet de Marais now decided he wanted to move the brothers. He had been very good to them and all that, but he had acquired an old priory that was next to the seminary, and he thought, well, it would be better to have all of his holdings together in one place. But the founder was dead set against moving the brothers because this priory didn't have any garden, again, the need for fresh air for the brothers, and no place where they could go outside for recreation and things like that, and not as commodious a house at all. So I guess you're going to do Hubert, aren't you, Gus? Or have you done them already? You did Hubert already. Well, anyway, these are the letters to Hubert where he's telling him, for heaven's sakes, don't do everything you can not to let this happen. And start up a campaign of prayer, especially the Blessed Virgin, and go to the shrine of Our Lady at Chartres, the Lady Chapel. Pray up a storm, so that this doesn't come about. But the bishop was determined, and then Deloso says, I'll see what I can do when I meet him in Paris the next time. But then by the time the bishop comes to Paris and so on, in October that year, the bishop died. So that was the end of that thing, and the brothers stayed where they were. So their prayers were heard. Then we have the foundation in Versailles, in 1709. In the Deer Park, right, part of the gardens of the Palace of Versailles. And this is the wonderful story of the Vincentian priest who had this wonderful brother director and so on. And he was so great and so on, and the founder, but this guy was he was close to the court and began to, get a slice of the good life, and he kind of liked what he saw. Here was a successful school, and he could be introduced and so on as the principal of the school, and all that stuff. And so the founder sees what's happening when he comes to visit, and he wants to change him right away. The pastor says, "No way! You're not taking this man out of here. If you take him, the whole thing falls apart." And so the founder figures he has no choice, so he leaves him there. So then finally one day, much to the pastor's shock, the brother throws his habit aside, goes out to leave. The pastor sends this old Vincentian, this pious old man, to try and persuade him to come back and so on. But the monk says, "No way, goodbye," and off he goes. And so the pastor never again interfered. So it's interesting to think, since we deal with Vincentians in a lot of places where we are, Lazarus, as they were called sometimes, and Lamb refers to them that way. So this was one Vincentian. We get another one down here in Boulogne. And at one point in one of his letters to Roland, the founder asked Roland, he says, "Be careful of those Vincentians," because the Vincentians he was sending a lot of the letters through the Vincentian priest in Rome. He says, "Be careful of them." He says, "Don't pick up everything that they say." And he says, they're trying to ruin the Institute here in Paris. Writing to Roland. So he was, although he had good relations with some of them, and some of them were very helpful to the Institute in getting founded, he was a little leery of stuff like this going on. See, both the Sulpicians, the Vincentians, the bishops, the pastors, everybody loved what they saw when they came in contact with the founder and the Institute and the brothers and the schools. That every one of them had their own idea of, first of all, maybe taking the thing over themselves. That every group that he ever ran into always felt, well, this is a great idea, but we could do a better job if we took it over for ourselves. This is a consistent pattern all the way through. We have the better, and that's, of course, why the founder stuck to his guns all the time. No, this way, this is the way we do it, and we don't want anybody else trying to tell us how to run our lives. So it's a marvelous sense of independence in some way. The brief school in Moulin, where, again, violating all the rules, this brother who was such a successful catechist that the pastor had him, the bishop had him giving model catechism lessons in church on Sundays and so on. This Brother Benil spent some time in that community. And then the foundation at Boulogne-sur-Mer with both with the upper town and the lower town, constructing the house and all that sort of stuff, and the influence of this layman again. So he and Jean's become good lay friends of the founder. And he goes up to visit them a little later on, as we'll see, and he receives them at St. Jan. Okay, so, again, to look at the map, that Boulogne, of course, is way up in the English Channel. We didn't get it here on this map, or either that or I cut the top of it off. But so, here we are in 1710, 1711. This is what, 30 years after the encounter with Adrien Niel, and we have the Institute spread all over France. And so in spite of all of those troubles and everything else, it's a great development. Now when we talk about the founder's trip to the south tomorrow, I hope you have the map in front of you and have some little bit of a sense of the history of each of these foundations. So when the founder comes around to visit them, we'll see all of these names again. And if you do this often enough, after you've read Blanc for the 5th time or 6th time through, you begin to feel very much at home in all of these towns, and especially if you've visited them physically, that's also something of a help. Yes,
All of these teaching and any of these operations, all those brothers did have vows?
not necessarily,
Not
no,
necessarily.
no.
Ah, I see.
Vows were optional. They remained, in a certain sense, optional until 1917 in the Institute. Because I've been trying to make that point all along, that the commitment was joining the Institute, taking the habit, and that was the fundamental consecration. And then some of them nailed it down by vows, and some, I suspect by this time, most of them probably did, you know, that type of atmosphere of piety and pressure and everything else and so on. If you just read Blanc, well, you can get clues though too, huh? That they were, if the founder was not a plaster saint, but was busy with all of this foundational work, and you can imagine for every one of these establishments, the amount of paperwork and letters going back and forth, and how long it took for this, from a letter to get from one place to another. And then all of the travel involved on the part of the brothers and on the part of the founder. He was continually kind of commuting between Rouen and Paris, but that's a good 80 miles, and doing it on foot most of the time. Huh? So this is we get a different picture of the founder. But we also, if you read between the lines of Blanc, the brothers were far from being all the saintly people that we sometimes think of those early brothers. We know from the letters that some of them were keeping the rule perfectly and so on, and we know from some of these characters that we've met, huh? All the crazy things with Ponce and Matthias from the letters, but then that rebel, huh? That Chétardi was continually trying to find the softies, and then De Brou going around and trying to remind them, oh, you could lead him, he's too strict on you, you know, and why don't you take one of us as a superior? We'll treat you nice, we'll give you wine and all that. And, you know, so, and a lot of them, and they didn't all resist either, huh? A lot of them were attracted by those bribes and such. So these men were in spite of the fact that they were following the rule pretty much to the letter. And then, of course, as we'll see, a lot of the trouble comes from the fact that if you look at all these foundations, well, there was a good bunch of them anyway. Huh? They finally got as many as 10 centered in that hospital in Rouen. So that was all right. And then they finally got 3 schools going in Dijon, so that was a fairly sizable community. But in the beginning, there were only 2 in Mons, and then eventually a 3rd one, but one of them was Ponce, so they had to be running around all the time. In Alès, there was only 2, and Saint Denis, there was only 2. Marseille, there were only 2 in the beginning for the longest while. So an awful lot of these were very distant communities of 2 men. Huh? One of them was the director. So how would you have advertisement and defects, for example? Because the director was exempt from, so you make the brother kneel down and give him a couple of shots on Friday night. And what would you do for recreation? A rule, huh?
Wow.
They must run out of those pious topics to talk about. And so, and when one of them probably had a cook and the other one do the dishes, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, you look at the way the things were in the concrete, it's not quite the way the book says. There's an awful lot of historical and religious writing to that effect nowadays, that especially about religious rules and religious, the founders of religious orders and general chapters and so on. These wonderful documents always depict things the way they're supposed to be, huh? And not the way things actually are. Supposing somebody outside the Institute were to read our present rule, for example. It says the brothers do this and the brothers do that, and the community is a place where the experience of God is shared, all those lovely sentiments and so on and so forth. And then you look at the actual state of the community. It doesn't exactly correlate. That's not really a description of what historically takes place. It's not an indictment, of course, because I think we're very conscious of that. That's a good statement of the way we think we ought to be, and the same thing was true of the original rule and the original writings of the founder and so on. But the actual physical reality might be a little different. Yeah, George?
you never talked too much about my affairs biography and all of this. Is there any reason why you don't bring my affairs biography up? Or
Well-
anything to say about it?
Now, every once in a while, I have a lot of notes here of places where my affair disagrees, but I really think that it's easier to do this working out of one text, which is really, and I prefer to do it with Bland because Bland is fuller. Bland was an authorized biography. Bland had the documentary sources at hand. He's much more interesting writer and so on. My affair, and that's one reason we send my affair out ahead of time, to kind of get a general sweep of the thing, so that we can go into this thing in detail. But the only reason for going to my affair would be as a check, to check back and forth on controversial facts. But I don't see where that's a terribly valuable thing to do. And of course, my affair, maybe there's a psychological reason too, because my affair loves to he loves to gloss over anything that's the least bit difficult or controversial or naughty, Where I think it's more fun to look at the controversial stuff and the naughty stuff and all that sort of stuff. So I think Bland's more fun, actually. That's probably, and it's a much fuller account. Right. My affair is a little better straightforward at keeping the history moving in some sort of a decent sequence, and he doesn't go into quite so many ecstasies and little sermons, although he has his share of them too. So I really haven't stated, I don't read the My Affair over every year, every time I do this, but I do read the Bland. Let's go and have some coffee.